So this is, for me, a fun lecture because today is a holiday south of the border, a so-called holiday, America Recycles Day. And it's all about America Recycles Day. I've been writing about it and having fun with it every November 15th since 2008, when I first wrote an article, Recycling is Bullshit, and saying, make November 15th Zero Waste Day. And my editors changed it to BS a few years ago. I started it with the paragraph that I repeat all the time. Let's call recycling what it is, a fraud, a sham, a scam perpetrated by big business on the citizens and municipalities. Look at who the sponsors are, and then I'll go through that. Recycling is the transfer of producer responsibility for what they produce to the taxpayer who has to pick it up and take it away. And America Recycles Day then had, as you can see in this slide, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Anheuser-Busch, Coors, Owen, Illinois, that makes bottles, and every big manufacturer, and it's a shadow of its former self. If you go to the website, there's very little on it in the America Recycles Day, and if you look at the sponsors for this one, it's really telling who these sponsors are. Altria is the fancy name for Philip Morris, a cigarette company. Santa Fe, cigarettes. Bottled water, one of the biggest sources of garbage. Kimberly-Clark, which is Kleenex and paper packaging, Anheuser-Busch and Heineken beer companies. That what we've basically got is we've got all these evil companies that make all the disposable crap, and they're sponsoring this holiday to pat us on the head for picking up their crap. And that's basically what it is. I mean, these are cigarette companies in particular. Who would think that anybody would want to have anything to do with that? And why are cigarette companies sponsoring America Recycles Day? Well, probably because they're scared. Because right now in Europe, what's happening is that the cigarette companies are being charged money to clean up cigarette butts on all the beaches and all the streets and that, because they're one of the biggest sources of plastic waste getting into rivers and into the water and that. And recycling has been turned into this thing where, you're a hero if you recycle. And look at the kids dressed up as heroes because they're going out and they're learning how to recycle. It's something that's done from the earliest age, Teach kids recycling is so important. I mean, you would never play with garbage trucks. You'd say, ew, but what does every kid start with? You've got your Playmobil garbage truck and your Lego garbage trucks and your Rocky Paw Patrol garbage trucks. They're inculcating into children right from the beginning that recycling is virtuous, recycling is the greenest thing that you can do. And everybody who recycles is a Superman, is a hero. And when they actually do surveys of adults about what is the greenest thing, what is the most important thing that you can do for the environment, for the world, better than conserving water, limiting your carbon footprint, sustainable foods, it's recycling, right up at the top. And so this is where we are in society, that they have trained us. So where did recycling come from? What is it? And why is it, like I say, so I will say evil? And what have they done with this?
Is this what people focus on, or what actually makes a difference?
I'm sorry?
Is the recycling at the top, is that what makes the biggest difference, or what people focus on?
That's what they focus on, what they can do. Okay. So, let's start with recycling. We didn't used to have recycling. Everything was recycled. Everything had a second life. There were people who would go around and pick everything up from you if you had metal. It all had value. There were junk buyers. My father's first job was for a company that, he married my mother, and my mother was part of this family that owned Toronto's biggest junkyard. And my father's first job was to, as soon as someone said, we got a car, we're buying a junked car, And he'd have to rush out first ahead of everybody else and get the battery, because the battery was portable and it was full of lead and it was the most valuable part of the car. So he would go that, and then the tow trucks would follow and they would go get the car. And rags, everything had a second and third life. When your clothing wore out so far that it was nothing left but rags, they would go and pick up the rags, because rags make the best paper. Fine paper was always made from rags. You can still buy drafting paper called drafting vellum, and that vellum is made from rags. It's got the strongest fibers, so there was always value right down in the end to picking up the rags. And when you wanted a cup of coffee, you didn't go to Tim Hortons and get it in a paper cup and take it out. You sat down in a cafe and you drank your coffee out of a china cup. And you gave the cup back. It's essentially you're buying the coffee and you're renting the cup. And this is what everybody did. If you wanted a coffee, you went into a cafe. If you wanted a soft drink, you got it in a returnable bottle. The cups were relatively small. You can see that's like a 5-ounce cup. And you look at all the coffee cups we get now, they're all 20 ounces. But because the restaurant was paying for the real estate, they didn't want you sitting there that long. So you got a coffee cup that was just 5 ounces, which is what we used to drink. And then if you wanted another, you might pay for it, or some places had bottomless cups. Or you got up and went back to work and did something. You occupied the seat, you had your little coffee, and you left. You didn't drink a coffee where you're walking or where you're driving or where you're working or you're doing that. You just basically sat down, drank it, and left. And everything was done like this. You would get your milk in bottles, and then you'd leave the bottles out, and they would get picked up, and a lot of food was delivered this way. And again, there aren't many traditional old diners left. This one's near our house, but there's still a few. You go, you sit down, you eat, you drink your coffee, you leave. And look at beer. Beer in Ontario, there used to be a brewery in every town. This is just O'Keefe Brewery, which no longer exists. O'Keefe Brewery had 5 breweries in Ontario because beer was sold in bottles. Bottles were heavy. Bottles couldn't travel very far and back if they were going to be reused, so you had lots of breweries. Roads were terrible. Well, I'll get into that later. Coca-Cola was like this. There would be a Coca-Cola bottling company, independent companies that would buy the syrup from Coca-Cola company. They would mix it with soda water. They would bottle it, and they would deliver it. And then they would come back and take the bottles, clean the bottles, refill the bottles, and sell it again. And this is happening. This is in every city. This is the Coca-Cola Bottle Company of Connecticut. Even on Earth Day, Coca-Cola got it. And they were talking about, the greenest way to do your Coke, to get your Coke, is in a refillable bottle. And the Coca-Cola company was marketing it that way. But things changed after the Second World War. One thing that happened, and this is controversial, people have argued with me about this point, but I've read a couple of books about it, is that it used to be that everything was concentrated in cities. So like all of business was in New York City, and industry was all, say, in Pittsburgh. And everything was concentrated because workers had to live close to the factories, so you had your factories and your offices in denser cities. And people came to cities to work in the factories and the offices. But once Russia had the atomic bomb, the worry was that one bomb dropped on New York City could take out all the businesses in the United States because they all had their offices there. One bomb dropped on Pittsburgh could take out the entire American steel industry. And so the program idea after the Second World War was decentralize. stop investing in cities, get factories and offices and everything out of the cities. So they built this highway network, the biggest American investment of anything that they've ever done, bigger than the space program, bigger than everything, $500 billion to build what they called the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. And they built these highways basically to make it easier to decentralize. And they drove highways into the middle of cities so that people who lived in the cities could get out, and the businesses people from the suburbs could get back in. And they basically, in most cities, picked the black areas and the slum areas, and they knocked those down to build all these highways. And if you were white, and if you got a GI loan, and if you weren't Jewish, you could buy a house for under $10,000 out in Levittown. And the idea, again, was decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. And this became the great American suburban project that Canadians looked at and said, well, that looks like a nice way to live. And so we copied this, even though we weren't as worried about bombs, which is why, by the way, Toronto and Montreal, one of the reasons, still have vibrant downtowns, because we didn't have this decentralization policy that they did. And so, they everything they could do in the States to promote the suburbs as wonderful and safe, and this is where you want to be, and here's a cheap mortgage, and here's this, and zero investment in cities. Zero investment. They basically said, sorry. And companies would have to move out as well. This was the first famous one in Hartford, Connecticut, a big insurance company. They basically moved out of a New York office building out into the countryside, and people could drive there. And IBM moved out of New York City and moved out to Rochester and had Eero Saarinen design these buildings. Bell Labs moved out. Everybody moved out. This was the whole principle. Get those offices out of the cities so that instead of just having one or two bombs, Russia needs hundreds of bombs because everything's spread out and you need another bomb for every factory. And people say, no, it isn't because of that, it's because of the automobile, and people had the freedom of the automobile. And it's backwards. The government wanted them out. And it's particularly why it was really favoring a white movement. They wanted the white business types, the factory types, everybody, all those good jobs left the city under government policy. And we're obviously still dealing with that now. I was in Denver a few weeks ago, as you know, the class we missed. And the entire downtown was a parking lot. They'd carpet bombed the thing to make parking lots because everybody was now driving from the suburbs to the few buildings that were left. And then the businesses left too, so there was nothing downtown. It was a wasteland. Now, what happened when all of these highways were built is that business changed as well. This is Bill Coors of the Coors Brewery Company. And Bill Coors spent millions to invest the aluminum can that we have. We drink our beer and we drink our pop out of. And he wanted the aluminum can because he didn't want to have to keep picking up bottles. It was expensive. If they had the can and the can could be thrown away, it meant that his beer wasn't pasteurized. It's still not pasteurized, which meant at the time he could only serve beer in 11 states that were really close to Colorado, and it was really expensive. But three things changed. One, he got the highways, courtesy of the American government building those highways. So he had his big plant in the middle of in Colorado, and he could make it bigger and bigger and bigger. Two, he had refrigerated trucks. Before the refrigerated truck was invented in 1935, you had to fill the truck with dry ice. It was really expensive. So you had glass bottles in trucks with dry ice, and they were going down terrible roads at relatively slow speeds. And it's no wonder, the beer was local and everybody drank local brands because shipping it anywhere was ridiculously expensive. So suddenly we've got the aluminum can. And that changed everything. And so that O'Keefe company that had five breweries became one brewery up on, and then it got bought out by Molson's, and then Molson's got bought out and merged with Coors, so it's now Molson Coors, and then Molson Coors got sold to a big Brazilian investment company. So we've gone from hundreds of different major brands of beer in Canada to two, and they're all owned by either Brazilians or Belgians. And this is what happened to beer. It got global. It's all because of the can and the highway. Now, the same thing happened with food. There was always street food. You always could buy food in packages like those cardboard containers. They actually started in New York with oysters. Oysters were a huge working man's food. They would be pulled out of New York Harbor by the tons, and so everybody would buy a cardboard box full of oysters. And then it got picked up by the Chinese food community. And you could buy stuff on stalls on the streets all the time. You could buy hamburgers. In my new book, I have a whole chapter on hamburgers, how the hamburger was invented and developed as basically street food like that. And then the highway came along, and people start moving to the suburbs, and people start using their cars to go to eat. And there was a time when you would drive your car and somebody would come out in roller skates or give you a tray that clicked onto the side of your house, your car. So it was really like dining in a restaurant with glasses and that, and it would get picked up and taken away, and that was too expensive. These guys figured out a better way. And the McDonald's people basically said, okay, if people are driving in cars now and the push carts have all been pushed off the street, basically, what are we going to do now? We're going to get rid of sit-down dining altogether because that's hugely expensive. We're going to industrialize production. We're going to let people do the work now. They come, they line up, they get the food, and they go back and eat it at a picnic table or eat it in their car. And so that was when McDonald's took off, and McDonald's was sort of in the West, and Burger King was started in Florida as a knockoff, and then Taco Bell was another one. Everybody knocked off the McDonald's idea. You drive to the restaurant, you buy your food, it comes in disposable packaging. And everything was about disposable, throwaway, single use. This became the culture. This was the idea of the future, that everybody would get this convenience of picking up your food with disposable stuff. And they thought we would be doing it at home too. And I called this all after, Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, called the military and business together the military-industrial complex. And I called this the convenience industrial complex, where all of industry, everybody re-geared to actually work with disposable stuff. The story of the aluminum tray here and the aluminum ply plate is interesting. After the war, I think I'd mentioned this in my lecture on aluminum if I did. After the war, they had all of these aluminum factories that were set up to make airplanes and not enough demand for aluminum. So the American company Alcoa had a competition. If you entered this competition with an idea of what we could do with aluminum, we'll give you a big prize. I think it was a huge prize. It was a $10,000 prize. The guy who owns the cottage across the lake from us up north, his father invented the aluminum pie plate. And of course, they're everywhere now, but the deal was we give you the money, and that's it. We own the pie plates forever. You're out of the picture. But he was able to, in the 50s, buy and build a big house and a big cottage with the $10,000 he got from inventing the pie plate. And the TV dinner plate was somebody else's great idea. Hey, in the Army, I had this plate divided in three. Let's make a disposable plate like that. Because they were desperate to figure out uses for throwaway aluminum. And the whole American economy was based on throwing things away and consuming. This is a guy named LeBeau, who was an economist in the 50s. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption a way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals. The very meaning and significance of our life today is expressed in consumptive terms. We need things to be consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing rate. And this is the whole economic principle of the time. So plastics production, you can see, has gone up from in the 60s for 15 megatons to 311 megatons. The paper cup is an interesting story. I have a whole chapter in my new book on paper cups, but I'm only going to give a very light version of it here, that the paper cup was invented in the late 50s, and it wasn't very good. They leaked. They didn't have the plastic liner that the Tim Hortons cups have now, which is a polyethylene liner, so you've got a cardboard cup. There were polystyrene cups. You may remember the white foam cups. You still see them occasionally. They're not legal in most places now. These cups became very, very famous in New York. The Happy to See You cups that were designed to look Greek because everybody who ran restaurants in New York was Greek. So they did all these Greek motifs on them, and they called them Amphora because he wanted it to be amphora, but he misspelt it. Amphora was a Greek vase. Anyhow, so disposable packaging, sort of paper cups started taking over. And I have a lot of these slides from a shutdown in the United States where Washington, the government ran out of money and sent everybody home because of a fight in Congress. And there were 3 or 4 days when Congress wasn't paying the people to pick up the garbage. And in 3 days, Washington was just covered in garbage. You realized in 3 days how much we depend on paying someone to pick up our garbage and take it away. That, the city was just buried in disposable stuff because it's a big tourist place. The other thing that happened, of course, is that cups just got bigger and bigger and bigger because Tim Hortons was really no longer responsible for you sitting in their place. You're taking it out so they could get more money out of you by making bigger cups. It used to be the bigger the cup, the more it cost them for real estate. And so now, I went through just looking at sort of the Getty images that nobody goes anywhere without something in their hands anymore. We're convinced that, all of these happy people carrying cups in the street in all of these images. It's just ridiculous. More happy images. Cup holders. The Japanese, when they were making, they had to send people over to buy stuff in the stores, because in Japan, nobody eats in their car. It's thought to be disgusting. You might do something messy. They don't have cup holders in the cars in Japan. They make them only in the export models. And they had to keep making them bigger and bigger, and then they had to accommodate juice boxes. And every time that they enlarged the cup holders in the Japanese cars, they'd find that somebody had made a bigger cup to where now you can stick buckets in the cars. And this is just constantly evolving. They're chasing. And people are assholes about it. Even in a Tim Hortons parking lot where you've got probably 20 garbage cans all over, they heave it out the window. And everywhere you go, you'll find Tim Hortons cups and McDonald's packages. And it's a huge problem. So these are slightly out of order, but like that. The other problem is water. Bottled water didn't exist, 30 years ago. And then they developed the cheap PET bottle, and they started marketing the shit out of it so that we all people started buying this water in bottles. All the drinking fountains conveniently disappeared in cities because the city said, well, why should we pay to maintain drinking fountains when there's bottled water around? And so you got water that's like from France and Evian and Fiji and all over the place. And they convinced us about this thing that we had to stay hydrated. And nobody ever had to stay hydrated. Our bodies are like camels. They're self-regulating. Unless you're constantly out doing something that's making you sweat a lot, then you know you don't have an issue. It's only when you lose water through sweating that it's an issue. But this whole thing, drink 8 glasses of water a day, was a fraud developed to get us to drink and buy more water and stay hydrated and buy their bottles. And they basically also denigrated the water supplies in cities. You know, there was one guy from Pepsi who said in the year 2000 that by the time we're done, water will be regulated for the only thing we'll be doing with water is washing dishes and taking showers. And has anyone here seen Idiocracy? Nobody's seen Idiocracy? You have to download and watch the movie Idiocracy, which is all about a world where everybody's really stupid, but they all drink this Brawno and they think the only thing water's good for is flushing toilets. It's extremely funny, and it's not a comedy, it's a documentary because it's where the world is really going. Anyhow, you've seen what happens with bottled water, and you've seen what happens with all of this, and garbage everywhere. And the thing is, this was the fundamental problem. You know, they loved the idea of this. Here you see an ad where they're actually drinking from the can and throwing the can away into the lake because no empties to return. And everybody did this. There was no culture of putting things in the garbage because nobody did it before. We had china dishes, we had china cups, and so people would just throw everything everywhere. Literally, you know, this is what it looked like. People just, you have dinner, you leave. There's a great scene in season 2 of Mad Men. I did up this lecture already this morning as a post on my Substack site, so if you go to Substack Lloyd Alter, you can hit the video where Betty Draper, they all go out for a picnic, and then Dad over there takes his can and he throws it into the field, and then Betty Draper just picks up the picnic blanket, shakes the whole thing out, all the garbage goes everywhere, and then she walks away. Because this is what people did at the time. So this was a real problem because people were getting angry. And so the producers, the bottle companies, you know, mainly the bottle companies, Coca-Cola, Libby Owens, Ford, the people who were making the packaging, they started this organization called Keep America Beautiful. And they developed the phrases, don't be a litter bug. And Susan Spotless says, every litter bit hurts. And they started putting waste baskets in places. But, you know, people still were throwing stuff everywhere. So they had to keep doing these ads. Daddy, you forgot. Every litter bit hurts. To train us not to just throw stuff on the ground, but to put it in the waste basket. And so this was a whole educational thing that happened through the 50s and into the 60s. You know, help Lassie, keep America beautiful, put stuff in. Aluminum cans, which were actually valuable, billboards, you know, recycle aluminum, cash for cans. It was the only thing. The problem is, for the first time, when a whole generation, when a whole nation starts getting disposables and actually putting them in waste baskets, is that cities then had to pay taxes, use tax money to hire people to pick up and empty those waste baskets and take them to the dump. And the dumps started filling up like mad in the 60s because there was all this waste we never had before. Everything was recycled, and now we've got all this incredible amount of waste, and the dumps are getting full, and it's a real problem. And in the late 60s, governments started talking about, okay, we're going to have to put deposits on everything. If you buy a thing like this, a bottle, even if it's a disposable package, we want a deposit on it. And so these so-called bottle bills were happening, and the companies all started fighting like mad. He says, this is a terrible tax. It's a tax. It's going to cost as much as everything else. Or, it's agreed. We'll spend $100,000 for litter control and $2 million to publicize it. So, the dumps were filling. The companies had a problem. They had to figure out a solution to this problem, and they came up with recycling. So, it won't go to the dump. It'll get picked up, and it'll get processed, and it will be recycled. And this was the big thing. In this 1970 famous ad with the crying Indian who says, my whole world is being despoiled by all of this. People start pollution, people can stop it. Turns out he was as fake as the whole recycling movement. He's actually an Italian actor. And it wasn't until after he died that they found that he wasn't named Iron Eyes Cody and that he was Emilio something. But that's what it is. And they invented recycling. They even stole the symbol. They had a competition. 18-year-old designed the chasing arrows. That they said, thank you very much. He never got a penny for it. And, that became the idea of recycling. Companies will take it back. And taxpayers pay a lot of money for recycling. They had to build all of these special trucks to pick it all up. Then they have to go somewhere and they have to pay someone to separate it all into the different piles. And then they had to try and sell it. So, you've got all these different ingredients. Because people throw stuff out the windows, we had to get people to actually volunteer to pick up garbage. Whenever you see an Adopt a Highway sign, which we see all over, what are they doing? There are people spending their time going around picking up bottles and Tim Hortons cups that people throw out of the windows. Go to the source of the problem, which is the people throwing it out the windows and Tim Hortons in the first place for selling them. But to have people volunteering to pick up garbage like this, that's corporate garbage, I think is appalling. And people die doing it. 3 Girl Scouts were killed in the United States when their project, some guy goes off the road. And that's where we came up with America Recycles Day, because the same companies wanted to keep emphasizing this idea that recycling is virtuous, recycling is part of the whole economic process. We love you for recycling. They had this campaign a few years ago, I want to be a bench. Well, that's not recycling, it's downcycling. If you're recycling, then your bottle becomes a bottle. But your bottle can't become a bottle because it's food-grade plastic, and if you go through the recycling process, you can't guarantee that it's still food-grade plastic, so it has to become something else. And there's only so much plastic lumber, only so many plastic decks, and how many benches you can make, and so it generally did not become a bench. A lot of PET plastic bottles, they said, would be recycled into clothing. You can buy, I've owned polyester PET from recycled bottles, but when you look at people like the Cradle to Cradle people, they say no. Because there's a catalyst when they make PET, and it's antimony, and antimony is toxic. And they said, no, you don't want to wear polyester clothes next to your skin and go and work out in it because you're going to sweat, and that antimony is going to leach out into you. This is controversial, but a lot of people have been really turned off polyester clothing because of this. And fleece, they turn it into fleece, and fleece clothing is one of the biggest producers of microplastics that go into the ocean and into our rivers of any material at all. And another study found that it actually, recycling, because we feel so good about it, because we feel so virtuous about it, it actually increases consumption. That we find out that Our experiment shows that consumers used more paper when evaluating a pair of scissors when they knew the paper was going to be recycled, and that they used more hand towels in the bathrooms when they knew then they had a big sign that it was going to be recycled. It was measurable that people feel so good about recycling that they don't mind using more. So we're wasting more paper and more trees with recycling. It's what Leila Akrogo called design for disposability. Our whole culture is based on, we design a disposable project, it has a reduced lifespan, it needs for new products, which means increased consumption. And it makes us, the market message reinforces it that, oh, it's fine, it's recyclable. The word recyclable is one of the biggest lies of them all, because doesn't mean it's been recycled. It means it can be, maybe in a perfect world, if it got picked up and if it was actually economical to do so. So what we were doing in all of those decades, particularly through this 20th century, because the plastics, there was so much of it that was coming out into the recycling centers. There was so much of it that it was, the value of it kept going down, because most companies want food-grade virgin plastics. They want virgin aluminum to build their MacBooks out of, because they've got to get the alloys just perfectly. The market for the recycled, the only thing that always had a good market was cardboard. Because of Amazon, we needed more and more cardboard all the time. So the city could make a little bit money collecting cardboard, but everything else was costing money. And what we were doing instead was filling up shipping containers, because so much came from China in manufactured goods that shipping containers go back to China for free, essentially, because there's no goods coming from Canada. And so it was very, very inexpensive to just fill them with garbage. So we were taking all the plastic garbage and all those containers that had to go back to China, we were filling them with garbage. And then they got to China, the labor was cheap enough that they could do the work of separating the useful and valuable stuff from the garbage plastics. So they were basically doing the work that nobody in North America was willing to do, to separate our recycling. You know, you've got to take the caps off the bottles, because the cap is polyethylene and it's got no value, but the bottle is PET, which has some value. So we're not going to do that in North America. That's a dumb job. So they shipped it all to China until China said no, because 80% of it that's not worth anything is just going into our landfills, that's going into our rivers. The Chinese economy was rising so that people weren't willing to do that job and earn that little bit of money anymore. So they basically said no, and they closed the doors to North American plastics. And the amount of plastic exported from the United States, you can see here, went down from 2017 down to a fraction of what it was. Going to mostly, still going to Vietnam, still going to Malaysia, still going to Indonesia, and they've all been cutting it out as well. So basically the plastics are just piling up in North America, bales and bales of them, because they just don't know what to do with them. And here we are again back at Washington, because I loved these photographs of this is what happens after 3 days of nobody picking up the garbage. The city is just buried in it. And my last, I think, Washington. So, what are we going to do? If we know that recycling, in fact, was a scam, that once it wasn't going to China anymore, what was going to happen? This is why I always say that so-called today's holiday, America Recycles Day, is a shadow of its former self, because people had begun to realize that this is all bullshit. Why am I spending a day pretending to pick up all this garbage and put it in bins when I know it's just going to go at the other end and go into a landfill? Or something's going to happen to that it's not recycled. Even in Toronto, the PET plastic is the only one that's worth value, and the HPDE, which are the really heavy plastics. Everything else is landfilled because there's no market for it. Nobody wants it. We dutifully put it in our blue bin and put it on the curb, and most of it goes to landfill. All of the black plastic, if you buy takeout Chinese food, you often find that the bottom of it is black plastic. They can't get black plastic out. All the Tim Hortons cups, to recycle a Tim Hortons cup, because of the plastic on the bottom of it and the liner of it, to recycle it, you've got to go and you've got to separate them from everything else. Then you've got to send them to a facility where they shred it. And then when they shred it, they let it soak in water for about 3 days, and the paper separates from the polyethylene, and then they skim off the polyethylene, which has no value, so it goes to the landfill, and then they take the rest of the stuff and they can turn it into Kleenex, into facial tissue. And you know where they do most of this? India, because the labor's cheaper. So they'll gather all the Tim Hortons cups and all the other cups, if they do separate them, and they'll fill a container and they'll ship them to India where they shred them. And this is the sort of idiocy of why these things should not be allowed. All of you with Tim Hortons cups in here, this should not be allowed. So, here you have all of the different kinds of plastics, and it's only the 1 and 2, PET and HDPE, high density polyethylene, that have any value at all, and all of the rest are just going into the garbage. Huge, huge quantities of it. And, we're making vast, vast quantities of it that we've got to get rid of it. It's leaking into the ocean. About 25% of, what's this chart say? This is the wrong one. 82% of Asian plastics end up in the ocean. 2% of United States American ones, 16% in the rest of the world. Huge amount of waste. And you see here, when they say it's recycled, look at the numbers. Make 78 million tons of plastic from 98% virgin plastic. 32% of it leaks into the environment, 40% of it is landfilled, 14% is incinerated, which is turning it right into carbon dioxide. And they say, we're getting energy out of it, but burning coal gives you more energy per kilogram than burning plastic. 14% is collected for recycling, of which 4% is lost just in the process of recycling. 8% is cascaded, meaning it's downcycled to something lower, so the bottles become benches and things like that. And only 2% is closed loop. 2% of annual plastic production is used for the same things that it was. 95% of the plastic packaging value is lost after a single use. And what's happening now is the oil companies, because they're going to be selling less oil, because we're getting to electric cars, are investing huge amounts of money into making new plastics. And so you're getting all of this that they assume now 6% of oil goes into plastics. They're projecting by 2050 it'll be 20% of it, and that the ratio of plastics to fish in the ocean will be 50%. There will be as much plastic in the ocean as there are fish. And what the industry wants to do is to develop what they call a circular economy for plastics, where it's collected, they say recycled, it's taken out and it's reused if we collect it all properly. And it's a fantasy. You'll hear all of this, we're shifting to a system where we design out waste and we reuse it. And you'll be hearing a lot, circular economy is the buzzword of the day, that we're in a linear economy now where we make waste There's the recycling economy that doesn't work, and the future is the circular economy, where everything goes in a loop. And in architecture and design, you think circular, it's a good thing. You design to take your buildings apart and things like that. But in this, when we're talking in plastics, the circular economy is a fantasy. And it's a couple of reasons. One, even the fashion industry, even people are complaining that when you downcycle PET, our water bottles, into, say, clothing, what it does is it means that there's not enough PET to actually be circular with bottles. You've got to keep bringing in new stuff all the time. So they're basically saying, no. If you pick up plastic, it has to go back into the same use as it was before. Turning plastic bottles into non-food applications that can no longer be recycled is not a circular procedure. There's also the laws of thermodynamics. It takes energy to take those bottles and to turn them into something new. And a lot of energy, just the laws of thermodynamics. Sometimes they're saying it could take 10 or 20 times as much to go through this chemical processing as it would be to go through circular economy with plastics as it would to actually do it. What they're training us to do, again, this is the next step. Remember that poster from America Recycles Day a few years ago where they said, the bottle wants to be a bench? Well, look at what they're saying now. This is really, really interesting. Society needs to stop thinking of plastic as waste, but as a renewable resource that needs to be disposed of properly. So what they're saying, they're training you now to say, oh, this plastic bottle is actually a renewable resource, which is the most twisted logic that you can possibly imagine. You know, you're taking a plastic bottle that was made from a fossil fuel and pretending that it's a renewable resource because you're going to go through this ridiculous process to try and get some chemicals out of it. This is what you're going to, and look what's happening. Recycling rate like dead flat, bottle consumption up. And what you have to be aware of, you're going to hear about all the time, is this idea of circular supply chains for plastic. What they want to do is they want to take your plastic and they want to go through these processes that they call thermal conversion, which means cooking it hot enough until it separates into chemicals. Chemical decomposition, they're going to take it apart. They're going to take all of this stuff, put it through all of these processes, and they say, look, we're going to make polymers so we can make good bottles again. We're going to make diesel fuel out of it. We're going to make syngas out of it. We're going to make them all into useful stuff. But it all takes far, far more energy to do these, to get these things out of it, than it does to do it in the first place. You've heard the term circular, and it makes sense, but the plastic industry has hijacked the circular economy by pretending that they can do all these things. And Greenpeace did a study and said it doesn't work. They fall flat. Really, all they're doing is incinerating it. Even a representative of an oil company said that the real commercialization of this is like going to Mars. It's impossibly difficult to do. A study just came out last month, that explained all the problems with it. And it's inefficient, energy intensive, contributes to climate change. According to the US government, the energy needs derived from plastic waste and chemical recycling can create as much as 100 times more damaging environmental and climate impacts than virgin plastic production. So it's all completely a fraud. And that's why but the oil industry still, because they want to convert, is spending billions and billions. It's bankrupting big oil. And everybody goes along with it because, as I've said before, the economy runs on consumption of fuel. It's just money is basically a proxy for the energy flow, the use of it. And that's why they're fracking for more gas, because natural gas is the main ingredient of plastics. And they're figuring out, plastic uses that are like ridiculous all the time. And, my favorite is the buying the oranges that have already been peeled. And the joke was, if only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so they didn't need to waste so much plastic on them, or plastic-wrapped bananas. This was all the thing that we, or what I think, turns out, I was soundly criticized after complaining about those oranges, because what they're for is for people who are disabled, who have arthritis, that they can't actually peel the orange themselves, and so these were actually done. So I don't complain about peeled bananas anymore, because that's who they're actually for. But I do complain about things like this, which is diamond ice. This is Tasmanian rainwater collected in Tasmania and put in plastic trays and sealed up in plastic and shipped out around the world so we can put them in our freezer and have Tasmanian rainwater ice. This is, who did the coconut water today? This is even stupider than shipping coconut water. And then, of course, we have the huge growth in takeout culture. And the waste, we're now getting restaurants that are designed to be nothing but takeout. There are these called ghost restaurants, dark restaurants that, they're all designed around the takeout. And Uber Eats tied up, there's more and more and more of this garbage being generated, all of this plastic stuff, to service this restaurant industry, this growing restaurant industry. And it's all single-use plastics again. Now, these sides are a bit out of place. I couldn't decide to leave them in or take them out, but we're all in our, how many people here are in a design building, like interior design? Okay, plastics in architecture and interior design are obviously a big, big deal. And one of the reasons I became an architect, that I went to architecture school, is I loved this building built in 1957 at Disneyland, which was all built by the Monsanto Corporation out of fiberglass, and it was this neat house on stilts, all made out of fiberglass. And, it had a central core, and everything was hanging off it, and everything inside was plastics. The entire house was plastics. The furniture, the carpeting, everything was plastics. When they finally decided to demolish this plastic house, they couldn't do it. It was so strong that they had to come in and cut it apart with saws, because this house was so strong and so well built. And you go to any trade show now, and they're telling us about plastics, the vinyl, the material of life. And they'll sell the vinyl and they'll say it's safe and it's efficient and it's responsible and it's economical and it's durable. And these are all lies. That you have to go back and look at how do they make vinyl. I mean, I'm standing on vinyl tile. These desks are topped in vinyl. Everything's made with vinyl. And what it is you make chlorine in these chlor-alkali plants, which are all down in the United States, and you make chlorine, which is a killer gas, and the chlorine is mixed with ethylene, which comes from natural gas, refining in a controlled process to make ethylene dichloride, which is converted to vinyl chloride. If you accidentally let this go or you burn it, it makes dioxins, and it's reactive and makes they're bioaccumulative toxic chemicals. And to make vinyl soft, you have to mix in these things called phthalates. I can never pronounce it. And they're not even chemically bound. They're just mixed into it. So they come out, and they come out in dust bunnies, and they come out in your shower curtain, and you can smell these phthalates when you get that new plastic smell. And the industry just keeps selling us vinyl. It's the key to sustainability. And there was a huge fight a few years ago about the U.S. Green Building Council on LEED decided that they were going to start saying that you lose points by using too much PVC, too much vinyl. And the industry went insane and brought out all of their big guns, and there was a fight for years where governments were saying LEED is now illegal in our state, and they tried to make lead sort of illegal at the federal government. The plastics industry, basically, and the chemical industry just went medieval on the lead, the whole U.S. Green Building Council to kill lead. They set up a separate thing called Green Globes, which was specifically designed to be friendly to plastics, and lead is never recovered. They spent so much money and so much time fighting the plastics industry that they missed the boat in so many other things that have been happening, all because the industry was stronger than we were in the architectural industry. So that was an aside, just, because vinyl is a plastic that's almost non-recyclable. And vinyl is full of chemicals. The newest one, PFAS, which is the new chemical, I can't pronounce what it is, they're fluorocarbons, that they're now, we're all worried about is the latest thing. These are in everything that we specify as architects and engineers. I'm going to actually do a lecture on them maybe next week, do a bit on them. I should have included them now because I have all this data on it. But they're going to be the next problem that we have to deal with. So we're bumming along. So we're back to single-use plastics. That was an aside going into architectural stuff. And why do we have to stop at the single-use plastics? Well, one, we know already that recycling is a fraud and it's not happening. But B, they're made from fossil fuels. They have a high carbon footprint. None of it, we saw 2% is properly recycled. It leaches toxins into our food. The PFASs are the big ones. Causes hormone disruption. I'm going to get into that one shortly. Pollutes our oceans, kills marine animals and birds, enters our food chain. It's worse than we thought. Yes, we should pass on takeout cups. All of this stuff that I see on tables all around here in front of you, all of this stuff, we've got to just pass on plastic cups, pass on plastic cutlery, straws, plastic bottles. This book was a complete shocker. I read it last year, and basically microplastics, we think of microplastics as sort of the bigger things, but in fact, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. They keep getting smaller to where they're microplastics that you can barely see. And we're breathing them, and they're getting into our bloodstream, and they're getting into our brains. All of these plastics could be ending up in our brains as they get smaller and smaller and smaller and causing neurological disorders. You're at this moment exposed to some of the highest concentrations of microplastics anywhere. Stare into the light pouring through a window and you'll catch glimmers of airborne microplastics floating around like insects. Leave out a glass of water and you'll find microfibers from your clothes, creating tiny dents of surface tension. Leave a glass next to your bed and when you change your sheets, and you'll see how many particles of the fabric flings into the air and settles in that glass of water. The dust that accumulates in corners and the lint that sticks to your clothes, it's all plastic. And that's why we have to switch to a zero-waste economy without all of this plastic. Now, there are people who are trying. There are companies like, I can't read it, it's backwards, that in the States, in New York, you can now go and order takeout, and it comes with these containers which you take back or they pick up the next time they deliver something. They're all coded, so if you take a month for your next order, the container goes back. This is becoming more common in the United States, and I don't think it's happening yet in Canada. A lot of companies are trying to develop plastic-free packaging, soaps, other things. This company, Loop, made deals with all of these companies, from Haagen-Dazs, everywhere, to basically have them all in refillable containers. You would order them, UPS would deliver them, then they would come and they would take them back. Limited people interested in doing it, limited distribution, hugely expensive. Nobody's doing it. Even Tim Hortons, that I love to hate, has been experimenting with washable, reusable packaging. that you can take it, you can get it, and then you can take it back and give it back to them. I was sent this, which I've been using, which is completely refillable, reusable, toothpaste tablets, mouthwash tablets, dental floss that's recyclable, all in glass containers that you can get, again, refills from them. It all came in these cardboard packaging. Did I like it? I don't mind the toothpaste bits. I use them. The dental floss thing, I dropped it, broke into 1,000 pieces, because glass is not as good as plastic when you've got little things like that. One TV company developed all of their packaging that you then can cut apart the packaging. I thought this was very careful, as if the packaging is the biggest input of a big 55-inch OLED TV, but it like nice thinking. And then you could cut up the package, you could turn it into this cat house or this magazine stand, and so that's clever thinking. But the main thing we need is policies that actually encourage us to not throw things away and to have a simple recycling system. And this is what I'm getting back to beer again. I'm going to need a beer after all of this, because Ontario had the world's best. Because this is all over Europe and Mexico and everywhere else, that in Ontario, ever since 1927, when Prohibition ended, we've had the beer store, which was really called Brewers Retail, where you could go, you could buy your beer in a refillable bottle, you could drink your beer, and then you would take it back. And they would take it, and they would wash it, and they would refill it. And it used 5% of the energy of making a new bottle or a new can, and about a third of the energy of a can. And you'd get your case of 24 and you'd do this, and they take it back and you wash it. And around the world, this is what's standard. It was like Norway at 95% of the bottles are refilled. In Ontario, it was 88%. This is a few years old. And it's been going down. In the USA, it's down to 3%. You cannot get a refillable bottle in the United States. And they, again, did it all with marketing. They said, ew, people put mouse and cigarette butts in the bottles, and they're disgusting. People in America think the idea of a refillable bottle is bad. But what's happening in Ontario now, thanks to Doug Ford? This summer, when I would go to buy a beer, you'd find one brand. Everything's gone to cans. Everything's in cans. There was one, Sleeman's, still had bottles, and I don't like Sleeman's beer. It's just, everything's going to cans. And there's a lot of problems with this. And Doug Ford is trying to close the beer stores. He said, we're going to sell beer and wine in convenience stores. And yesterday's paper showed the end of the beer run is beer over. And they're going to close all these. And you know what happens? Every variety store has been known since the 50s. You want cans. You want cans because they're easier to unload. You don't have to deal with the returns. You make more money. Canned beer is a godsend. And this is back in the 50s when the cans were just coming in. The same story is true. And the problem with cans, beer or soda pop or Coke, especially if you're a woman of childbearing age, is that the cans are all lined with bisphenol A epoxy. If you didn't have the epoxy, they would all taste like aluminum. And, they would have a tinny taste. It's really not I remember what it was like. And so they're lined with bisphenol A epoxy, and bisphenol A is a hormone disruptor. It, in fact, was invented in the 30s when they were looking for a hormone to be a birth control pill. And it didn't work very well as a birth control pill, but it worked really well as a plastic. And so we had those polycarbonate bottles a few years ago that everybody drank out of, and then suddenly we had to get rid of them all because they were full of BPA. And they didn't tell us that they were still lining the inside of every tin can with BPA. And Coca-Cola says, yes, we do it. Governments say it's fine. It's not a problem. Should you be worried about BPA in your beer can? Yes, you should. Starting in the 90s, scientists have sounded the alarm about BPA, its ability to mimic the hormone estrogen, and linked it to breast and prostate cancer, reduced fertility, diabetes, genital defects, and altered behavior. And it's one of the causes for the huge baby bust, the decline in fertility. The most likely cause of this is endocrine disruption, which is the hijacking of our body's hormone systems by environmental toxicants. And every time you're drinking a can, you're getting some of this shit in your system, even though the government says, well, maybe yes, maybe no. And that's what makes me so angry about the beer store thing. That, you don't even have a choice anymore. I can barely find bottled beer, and when I get a beer, I'm forced to drink it out of can. Now, fortunately, I'm not a woman of childbearing age, but like all of you who are, should take this issue seriously. And no more drinking out of cans. That's what I would say. Well, this is where it goes back, to get to a real circular economy. It's not just going to be a better cup. It's not just a Tim Hortons paper cup. We have to change the way we think. We have to change the culture, not the cup. We've got this where you've got everybody lining up to get their Tim Hortons. In my chapter on coffee cup, on the single-use coffee cup, the single-use coffee cup made this possible. It made the drive-through possible because you don't have to go in and get your China cup. And you're not going to give them a refillable cup. So the single-use coffee cup made this possible. And everybody says, oh, the cup is only 110 grams of carbon in producing the cup. But the average Canadian idling puts out 400 grams of carbon just sitting there and waiting for the coffee. You have to look at the whole system. The disposable cup caused this lineup. The disposable cup made a whole infrastructure possible of takeaway drinks like this. And as you say, as I said before, they got bigger and bigger and bigger. I liked this drawing that showed that, the average capacity of a human stomach, 30 ounces, and you can buy 24-ounce coffees now. That's bigger than a bladder. So, how do we change the culture? Well, my favorite picture is this is 30 people getting coffee. 30 in Paris, where you sit down and you enjoy your coffee in a cup, and 30 in cars going all the way around the block and sitting there for 5 minutes waiting to get their coffee. The difference. When they invented espresso, in Italy, the name espresso, express, speed. The idea was that you got your little cup and you knocked it back. And I've been to espresso bars in Italy where you go, you stand up, you knock it back. And then it's a tiny little cup, and that's what you do, and then you give them the cup back. This guy, getting on the train, knock it back, here's the cup. And it's a cultural thing. Or you sit down, you read your paper, and you drink it out of the cup. You slow down. You sit down, you relax, you drink your coffee, you drink your glass of wine. These guys have their cigarette too, it's Italy. And then you give it back. And this is how we have to start thinking. I don't know why I'm ending with this. This is my last slide. This is the slide about donut economics, that we have to find a happy medium, a happy place where we can all live comfortably, and that's what this donut is, the safe space for humanity. And that means that we have to find a spot. Okay, we're going to still need plastics. Plastics are important for medical uses. We couldn't have gone through the pandemic without the plastics that all our protective stuff was made from. It's still got an important use, but 40% of plastics are going into these single-use plastics. 40% of them are going into these stupid single-use water bottles. And so much of this is waste. This is needless waste. And so, if we're going to find that safe space for humanity, we've got to make the right decisions about what we do. And one of those decisions, and I think this, that I've tried to say here on this America Recycles Day, is that we have to realize that just putting something in a bin doesn't mean it goes away, doesn't mean it gets recycled, shouldn't make you feel better, because as I said, it's all a sham. It's all designed to make us buy more plastic. They're selling us plastic, not coffee. And so that's it. I'm going to hit stop.